In 2007, Nile released their fifth studio album called Ithyphallic. This was a highly anticipated release because in 2005, Annihilation of the Wicked just blew the doors off. Neil Kernon managed to crack the code, crushing clear guitars, amazing full-sounding drums, just an awesome, overall amazing, fat, sonic, brutal experience of a mix. It was literally the best Nile had ever sounded up to that point. And because Neil Kernon was behind the desk for Ithyphallic, it was sure to be an evolution of Nile's sound, right? Well, the album came out and it sounded like this. After listening to the album, we were all left wondering, what happened? What happened to the guitar tone? The guitar tone on Annihilation of the Wicked was just everything that you would ever want from a death metal guitar tone. But hearing Ithyphallic, it was really bright, harsh, and brittle. We're just, what happened? And unfortunately, a lot of those questions really overshadowed Ithyphallic as an album because the lackluster production is really what a lot of people remember. There's a lot of killer songs on Ithyphallic, As He Creates, So He Destroys, Laying Fire Upon the Pep, The Essential Salts, Even the Gods Must Die. We cannot forget
Papyrus Containing the Spell to preserve its possessor against attacks from he who's in the water.
Now, obviously, there would be no way of trying to understand what happened in that session unless you were able to get the multi-tracks where you could look at them, throw them up in a DAW, and look at everything in its raw state to see where something might have gone wrong. Now, today is your lucky day because I happened to get the actual multi-tracks, the raw multi-tracks from the session itself, and I did my very own mix of Papyrus, and it sounds like this. Now, before diving in and looking at everything, because oh boy, there is a definite problem with the guitar tone, I just want to let you know I got these exact multi-tracks from Karl Sanders himself, and I have his full permission to make this video. These are the actual true blue raw recorded files from the session itself. Now, I know I told you there's a problem with the guitar tone, but let's just go through this in a linear fashion, okay? Now, when I was looking at the drums and I brought them in the Cubase here, there is really nothing wrong with the drum recording. It's really good, and George's performance is incredible, as we would expect it to be. Now, there are a couple of things that I noticed right away when I brought these in. For example, if we look at all of the overhead microphones, the overheads essentially are all acting as spot microphones. We can see here that we have 4 overhead microphones, and it's pretty much trash and china. So that tells me that the overheads were probably pretty close to the cymbals and spaced out. And this is not really an overall kit picture that you would be trying to do with overheads, maybe like a meter above the kit or something like this. And the second thing is there are no room mics. Now, I understand the logic of not recording room mics with music like this. I completely get it. However, there still is something to be said. Even if you're going to turn the room mics down to like minus 20 dB in the mix, distorting them and trying to filling in the cracks of the tone of the drums just helps bring a little bit of space and vibe to the drums. And that's what I felt, honestly, was missing. The drums feel very close and narrow in the production. And so that's what I wanted to do here. I wanted to see what can I do to expand the drum sound. So the first thing that I did with the overheads is I put them all into a group track here, and then I did the coda trick, So I narrowed the stereo field a little bit because when I was listening to this, it really felt like the china was over here behind me, and I would rather just have it over here, like here, where it might exist in real life, you know what I mean? Even if that's not really the case, because guitars are panned 100% left-right, and they are the widest thing in the mix, and they need to kind of have that space. So I brought the overheads in a little bit, and then this is one of the first things I started working on. You can see here that I did a massive boost on the snare fundamental, because I just felt that the snare was really thin. Even though the drums sounded good, and George played them perfectly fine, I just felt that the snare drum itself was a little bit on the thin side. So I started boosting the fundamental frequency of the snare starting from the overheads. you know, we have something like this. Okay, it's not really doing a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but I am trying to bring those frequencies out in the overall drum sound. Now, these are just basic moves on the overhead, some dynamic EQ to deal with frequencies and things like this. All right, and then the next thing I did was, as I felt that the cymbals were a little spiky, a little harsh. And this is just a tape saturator plugin that's stock with Cubase. And I just kind of saturated the cymbals a little bit to smoothen them out a smidge. You can do that with the HF adjust knob here. So darkening them a little bit like that, saturating the cymbals a little bit like this, and bringing them down in level, just kind of harmonically makes them more pleasing to listen to. That's all that I did there. And then I did another cool trick, which is I added reverb directly to the overheads. Because there's no room section here, there's no vibe, it didn't feel like any distance or space. It just felt like the cymbals like right here in my face. So I added some reverb to the overheads. So a little bit of reverb here just creates a little bit of distance and 3D aspect of the drums there, which I personally felt was important to help making these drums sound a bit wider. All right. And that's the extent of the overhead processing. Now, when you move on to the snare, I realized that, you know, when I'm looking at the snare here, we've got a snare top, a snare bottom, a snare side, which George did not play on this track, so I didn't do anything with it. And then we had two triggers here that Kernan set up. It looks like they're used for two different purposes. One is reinforcing the drums during these harder parts and the skank beat patterns. They're not on the blast beats at all. And then the snare big, Kernan actually names this the big fat bitch, which is cool. Which pretty much tells me, I would assume, that he was using this trigger to sample a reverb or to trigger a reverb. And I essentially did the exact same thing. Well, what I really wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that George's acoustic drums came out as much as possible, especially the snare. And this would have been very hard to do 20 years ago, but these days it's pretty much simple because of this little plugin here called Drum Leveler from Soundradix. If you are working on acoustic drums with blast beats and you want to have a consistent performance and you want to make sure the blast beat can be audible, this is pretty much a required purchase, okay? Let me show you what this does to see, so you can see and understand how powerful it is. So I can set a target level here, essentially where I want the snare drum to basically be around. Anything that goes above this target level, Drum Leveler will kind of bring it down in volume. And then anything that is below that, it'll bring it up in volume. And you can change how hard or how much it'll work with this compression setting here. So basically, I am making it work 70% to the target threshold, top or bottom, okay? So if we look at these harder hits, we can see that it's bringing the level down, but also these last two final hits, it brings the level up. This really just makes the performance a bit more consistent without changing the sound of it per se, okay? Because you're not layering a sample. But the most important aspect of this is when we come into the blast beat. So we have the regular hits here. Sounds great. That is the magic of this plugin. Now you can hear that George is hitting the snare drum. He's just not tapping it, but it's just the nature of death metal and the way that physics works with drumsticks, right? So without the drum leveler, you would have something like this. And that is just going to disappear in a mix no matter what you do, okay? And that's why back in the olden days, 20 years ago, a lot of triggers were used, to make the snare audible, right? And then what I did, again, the same thing with the EQ. I'm really hammering on this fundamental frequency because I just found the snare to be very thin. So if I turn the EQ off, I mean, the snare itself sounds fine. It's no big deal. But if we go ahead and pump up the fundamental frequency here, we're getting a lot more fatness. put into the snare drum. Really, really important. Okay. Now, as far as cymbal bleed, because you're going to notice here there's a tom fill that's very clearly in the snare drum mic. And the reason that happened is because when I was listening to the drums as a whole, that bleed kind of actually made everything sound better. It didn't make anything sound disconnected from each other. And that extra attack and those extra cymbal bleed just helped the toms cut through and sound better. So I didn't completely gate everything out of the snare drum. What I did instead was this nollie trick with Saturn. This is also really important to consider because when you're doing these really fast blast beats, there are really great gate plugins, FabFilter, Pro Gate, then Black Cell Audio Silencer, which is probably the best gate plugin on the market right now. They really aren't going to work the way that you want them to work as well as Saturn does, because Saturn is only pushing the cymbal bleed down a little bit. It's not completely eradicating it without really messing with the tone of the drum that much. And like I say, I did not create this technique, Nolly did. I'm just using it here because it really worked well in this application. So if we go to the blast beat here, I'll turn it off and then I'll turn it on. So you can just hear how the cymbal bleed just goes down in volume and the snare becomes the loudest thing. It really just brings the snare out without completely killing all the cymbal bleed, so it actually sounds a bit more natural when you come to think about it. Now the last thing that I did on the snare itself is I did kind of the reverse of what Nolly would do with the Pro MB here, where he's pushing the cymbal bleed down when the snare hits. I'm actually pushing up 5K when the snare hits to put some more air and stick on the snare when the snare is hit. Okay, so it just has some more bite, some more crack, and more snap. And that is multi-band, so dynamic EQ, if you will, only when the snare is being played. Now we go out to the snare bottom mic. Just kidding, nobody cares, it's basic EQ. Snare side wasn't used. And so the snare trigger, I'm doing the exact same thing with the snare trigger here. I'm really trying to beef up the body of the snare. I want thickness, I want body in the snare. I want it to be like someone's punching you in the chest, when the snare is hit. And I'm adding a little bit of reverb here, specifically, again, to try and put ambiance and space in the drum sound. And this is very apparent with the big snare trigger, which happens on, this big chorus section over here, right here. It's just a giant reverb, right? Now, if you put all the snare tracks together on this, that might sound a bit ridiculous, but when you put it in context of the full mix, you'll understand. Fits right in, and there's just enough reverb in there to add some depth and space, and it sounds like the drums are in this cavernous place, right? As far as the drums are concerned, it was pretty straightforward, recorded very well, as you would expect. George, amazing drummer, nothing really of note to speak there. George, you fucking crushed it, buddy. You're awesome, and your reputation is well-deserved, okay? The only thing that I did is I just wanted to try and make sure George's natural snare was on top most of all. The last thing that I spent a lot of time on was with the trigger. The trigger, again, I just wanted to shape it more to my liking. And for this particular song, I felt that the ball slap area, we just call it the ball slap, of the kick was cutting through the wall of guitars a little bit better. So I came up with a sound like this. The original sounds like this. Okay, I also reduced the volume of it in FabFilter here itself. But you can see how I shifted the frequency more into the upper ball slap area and not so much the clicky ticky part of the drums. And so at the end of the day, you get a full drum sound like this. Sounds really nice in my opinion, okay? So if we move on to the bass now, bass with Nile it couldn't be more straightforward. In fact, it's pretty much a situation, bass and Nile is just like backseat situation. It's really just there to glue the mix and to create width and body of the overall mix, which again leaves us asking why was Ithyphallic so thin and hollow sounding, and it really comes down to the fact that I think the bass was turned down too much. That's what it boils down to, right? So the processing on the bass it's ultra simple, just like basic bitch stuff here. So the original bass tone is this. Pretty normal bass tone. You can hear that it's been crafted specifically to just be thick in the low end, not really meant to cut through and grind or dingle, you know, like a lot of the modern metal stuff. It's just there to exist as a foundational element. So that's all I did. I did some EQ for this. Once again, also turned it down 6 dB in FabFilter. But I'm just doing basic cuts here, taking the mid-range out and accentuating a little bit of the pick attack, just a smidge, not a lot. And then what I've been doing lately is this multiband trick that I learned from Mendel. I really like this. I've been using it a lot. It's just a basic multiband pattern here, different sections. I have different control over each section, so I can dynamically EQ the bass and keep it under control pretty much all the time. And that is the basic idea of what I've done here. So you can hear I'm keeping the low end pretty much under control all the time. I'm not worried, or I'm not trying to change the top end very much. And in fact, I actually increase the top end a little bit. But this all works independently and dynamically. It's a great way to control the overall bass without having to get too crazy. And then finally, we just do the classic L2, which is we just kind of pin it so that we can move the bass where we want, so that the bass doesn't flop around and stuff in the low end and makes things sound uneven. So when we have drums and bass together, we get this result. So everything's sounding pretty good so far. All right, now we get to the part of the video where things are going to get a little bit rough. And, you know, I'm just going to play the guitar tone with no processing. This is the raw guitar tone that was recorded on the day. And if you're on headphones or you're listening to this loud, you might want to turn your volume down, all right? I'm going to press play in 3, 2, 1. So yes, that is an exceptionally harsh guitar tone, and I don't even know what to say. I was blown away when I heard this, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing at how just objectively bad it is. Okay, I'm just gonna say it's harsh, it's brittle, it's thin. It's objectively a really bad guitar tone. I do know how the tone was made. Okay, the gear is exactly the same from Karl's side as it was on Annihilation of the Wicked, but the microphone's different. As far as I understand, Neil Kernan decided to use a Heil SM57 clone style microphone, and so with all that being said, I simply cannot understand the microphone position that was decided upon for this album. And in really trying to understand this mix, I'm puzzled. Okay, I just have to be honest. I am outright flabbergasted that this is the tone that made it on to the album. And it's a shame because Ithyphallic suffered greatly because of this guitar tone. And I think this guitar tone kind of pushed Kernan into a corner with how he had to mix the rest of the album. And frankly speaking, guys, this guitar tone 20 years ago, unfixable in the mix, okay? Speaking of that, let me show you guys how I fixed the guitar tone with this mix here. So what I opted to do here is I went one by one, okay? The first thing I did was I attacked the major issues, so basic low pass, high pass here. I attacked the major issues that were happening here. And as you see, we have massive peaks in literally the worst spots. 2.5K, 3.6K, 4.8, 5K, 6K. These are, it's 4 of the worst areas that you could have problems in your guitar tone, and they are massive. So here it is without the EQ. Gigantic difference. Okay, gigantic difference. That's not all though. We got to keep going. We have some other problems that we need to fix. It's multiple stages of EQ, guys. Multiple stages of EQ. So here's the second EQ bypassed. I'll enable it. So you're hearing that the tone of the guitar tone shifts a little bit. It's not shifting the tone. We're actually getting what the microphone actually recorded. We're hearing now the actual guitar tone instead of the psh that came originally with the microphone, okay? So this is all static EQ that I've done here. I've done the Andy Sneap C4 trick, just doing all of the low end here instead. And then I have the L1 limiter, you know, we all know how that works, okay? Now, I did that for every single guitar track because all the guitars were tracked through the same chain, through the same way, through the same tuning. There's no reason, you know, it's all the same stuff, all right? What I did then is I put that all into a bus or a group, all right? And here is my guitar group. So here are the guitars EQ'd as they are right now. Here's how they sound. Sounds a lot better. And if you forgot what they sounded like originally, so the guitar tone itself hasn't changed. We're just getting rid of all that harshness, okay? Now the problem is there's still harshness, but it's not in a static way anymore. Now we are getting harshness that's happening when different notes are changing or different parts of the song are being played. So on the group track, I opted to do dynamic EQ, a lot of dynamic EQ. And this is precisely why this guitar tone would be impossible to fix 20 years ago, because you didn't have this technology back then to dynamically, parametric style, do deep surgical cuts on a guitar tone. So here's what it sounds like. We're just getting rid of all the white noise and that's happening, okay? And we go one by one here. This took me about 2 days to do, by the way. I had to come back a couple of times and redo this. So here's the next EQ. All right, moving on to the next EQ. It's all the same thing, just dynamic EQ, trying to smooth out and hone the tone as much as possible. That one's a really subtle honk. Probably didn't really hear that one, but that one's in there. And then we have the final EQ, which again is just trying to take care of these nasty resonances and whistles in a dynamic way. Keep it as musical sounding as possible. Sounds like this. So we have done an ultra metric shit ton of EQ. And there are problems with doing this much EQ, obviously, we all know it, but this is just what has to be done sometimes, okay? I did do another Andy Sneap, just a little bit of extra controlling of the palm mutes, especially during the chorus. Now, the major issue is this, all right? We've done so much EQ and we have effectively dulled the guitar tone to a degree where it doesn't really have a knife edge anymore. It's not aggressive sounding. It's not really, I mean, it's pleasant and pleasing to listen to, but it's not death metal, right? And in comes in a technique that I've been doing for a long time. I am essentially going to be boosting everything at 5K in a shelf style, not the bell style, the shelf. So from 5K and up, I am boosting 4 dB. What this will do, this will bring back energy into the high end of the guitar tone, which we would hope makes it sound aggressive and brutal again. There we go. So we have injected some energy back into the guitar tone without having those insane spikes and frequency problems. All right. And then we have the limiter here. And again, so I'm going to do a full A-B again, what the guitar tone started as and what it is after all the work that I had to do on it. So here we go. It's not perfect, but I would say that that is an order of magnitude better and more listenable. So, guys, spend the time to learn how your microphone works and how IRs and speakers function. And if you don't know anything about that stuff, go to my website, chernobylaudio.com. The metal guitar workshop is what you're looking for. I will teach you exactly how to avoid this exact situation, okay? So guitars are done. We put those into the mix, and we're getting something like this. Nice and fat, wide, sounding pretty damn good. Now it's time for vocals. Now, I gotta give Kernan credit here. The vocals were fine. I really wasn't a big deal. One thing that I really think that Kernan did a good job with was finding places in the vocals to do like reverb tails and delay throws, and actually replicated a couple of those that he did. In particular, this section here, which I really thought sounded cool on the album. I did my own version of it. Sounds like this.
Thou spawn of search, devil be for me.
Kind of like a little ping pong back and forth. Not really that loud in the mix. But then here's another one.
In the presence of Raw.
That sounds so damn cool. I mean, in the mix, it sounds like this. That's awesome. You know, so Kernan did a really good job, like injecting atmosphere and space in the vocals, stuff like that for the mix. I think that was really cool. And like I said, I replicated some of that in my own way when I did my own version of the mix. As far as processing vocals, it's death metal. It's pretty fucking simple. You do EQ. What you want to do with the EQ is you want to kind of thin out the low end a little bit because you're going to smash this stuff through a compressor. I do a little bit of sibilance, dynamic EQ up here on the top with Fab Filter. And then Distressor, baby. Distressor is the classic fucking move. Distressor into an LA2A style plugin. Super fucking classic. And then we go into Puke Tech here where I am just boosting around 5K to try and put the vocals on top of the guitars. Frequency-wise, not really volume-wise. So if they cut through the mix a little bit, I can actually show you what that sounds like. So I'm not turning the vocals up per se volume-wise. I'm just kind of setting them on the guitars a little bit. Specifically around 5K, remember, because from 5K we're boosting the guitars. Around 5K we would be boosting the vocals. So you kind of have the vocals here and the guitars here, or it would be like that for you guys. So something to keep in mind. But this is very standard fare. In fact, actually, I remember watching the video about the DVD Making Things That Gods Detest. I'm fairly certain this is pretty much the exact chain that Kernan used on that album. Sans the Fab Filter, obviously. But all the vocals go through the exact same chain. It's all the same stuff. Nothing new here. And at the end of the day, they sound like this.
Tiles come forth from their holes. Beast from a crocodile. Thou spawn of search.
Yeah, awesome. And that pretty much leaves us to what I did on the master channel, which is not much. Okay, I still felt that the mix was a bit harsh going into the master chain. So this tape saturation plugin was an afterthought after I had already brought it up to level. And you're going to hear a major difference here. So let's do that. It's just soaking up the last little bit of harshness from the guitars and the cymbals and just spreading them out a little bit, little harmonics, stuff like that makes it pleasing to listen to. All right. Oxford Inflator, which has been kind of a secret weapon I've been using a lot lately. Really love this plugin lately. And then I'm just going into Ozone 11 here. Have EQ. This is another trick that I learned from Coda. Usually there's some buildup between 100 and 200 hertz with fast tempo music because of the bass and the kick drum. You find that, pull that out. It cleans up the lower mid section there. It's really good. And then a high shelf boost to try to bring some of the high end energy that might have been sucked in from the tape saturation plugin. And I am actually putting this at 7 LUFS, which I never do. I usually do 9 LUFS, but it's Nile and it's death metal, and this would have been in the loudness wars in the early 2000s. So I pushed it a little bit harder. And so at the end of the day, we have a result that sounds like this. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed watching it. It's a very unique experience to be able to mix one of my favorite bands, Nile, and Ithyphallic, like I said, is an album that I do like a lot. There are a lot of amazing songs on there. So it was awesome to be able to look at Papyrus and kind of mix it in a way that would be sonically pleasing to me. I hope you learned a lot of things in this video, and above all else, get it right at the source, okay? You'll save yourself a lot of trouble. If you're struggling with stuff like that, again, my website, ChernobylAudio.com, I've got the metal guitar workshop that shows you guys how to avoid exactly this situation so you don't run into a terrible guitar problem, all right? Thanks again for watching the video, guys. Hope you have an amazing weekend. I'll see you soon. Have a good one.